Okay, so on last tutorial we have done a basic setup for Node.js TypeScript and Express.js setup using TypeScript REST. If you haven't watched that video, please check that out for getting a more context here. But today we are going to implement an actual PostgreSQL connection with our TypeScript and the REST API, which is going to be a basic user entity or user model, whatever you can call it. It will be a table inside our Postgres, which is going to be connected over TypeORM, which I use regularly for almost all of my TypeScript-based projects. You can find the actual public repository for this project, and it will be a generic starter kit for anyone who wants to get started with TypeScript and Node.js project, especially for the REST APIs. It is under my GitHub profile, and you can see a link down below on this video. Comment if you have any questions relating this project setup, or even a README that you will feel there is less documentation. I'll try to describe a lot more than it exists right now. So if you remember last time, we actually had a setup with this pretty basic index.ts file, which handles all of the configuration setup and other processes that we need to spin up an actual Express application and an actual TypeScript REST server, which is basically a class-based routing that we are using for our application. So to communicate with the PostgreSQL database over Node.js and TypeScript setup, I'm using a TypeORM library, which is pretty popular ORM for communicating over Node.js and TypeScript. It stands out from the other ORM libraries for Node.js because of its tight integration with TypeScript and the real type definitions that you actually need to write your models, and then use an actual ORM functions to, let's say, find a specific entity or find one, or I find many that we'll see later on this course. So to actually install that, we just have to make yarn add TypeORM, which is most probably going to install similar to this version if this video is not that outdated. But they don't have some kind of like breaking changes, and I use consistently and without like even having any issues with versioning that you are getting for some of the like other npm libraries. So it's pretty good quality in open source project. So to have a basic setup, TypeORM doesn't require that much, but you should have at least one single configuration file that TypeORM uses as a main entry point, and it actually handles all of the configurations using that single configuration object. So to make that, we actually have to create a file in a root src. That's matter of choice. I'm usually doing that in src folder itself, naming orm config .ts. So the trick is that usually TypeORM itself doesn't read an actual TS file, which means that you can actually define some GS or JSON files, which is a pretty standard way of doing that. But for TypeScript files, you just have to add that manually. So you just basically have to define a TypeScript file which will handle like all of the configurations and environment variable setups that you probably want to have for your PostgreSQL. The actual thing that we don't want to define a JSON file, but instead we want to define an actual dynamic generatable TypeScript file is because we are going to use a different environments for our application, and for that we can't actually have multiple JSON files and copy everything all over the place, which will be a lot uglier than this. And for this, like, you can define pretty much everything as an environment variable, like db host, db port, and db username, and make it very flexible. If you are, for example, deploying your application to Heroku, you can basically define that over the environment variables, or even like if you are deploying that as a Google Cloud function or AWS Lambda function, you can define environment variables directly in admin panels that their cloud providers are giving, so you don't have to keep a separate configuration files, which is pretty handy. And I'm using like default values as a reference to an existing local database that I'm using for local development, but you can like define anything you want. It doesn't matter, it's not specific for my local environment. You can just change this whatever you want. And one important part that I want to mention in this configuration file is that first of all, you can see that there is a Boolean variable checking if this project is compiled or not, which is pretty important, because if this project is compiled already, then all of the files are with JS extension. And if you want to import an actual entities or model files automatically, you just have to decide whether it is TypeScript or JavaScript, because when you are deploying to production, it is most likely you are doing that with JavaScript compiled version. So you just have to import your JS files instead of TS files. That's the real difference there. And rest of the logic is pretty much simple. If, for example, do we want to have a database synchronization with our PostgreSQL database, which means that do we want to TypeORM make our tables and SQL initial queries, like making a tables, modifying tables based on our class fields, or do we want to enable SQL query logging? This is handy when you want to debug something, but for the production it's useless and it just uses more space and really dirty when you're trying to debug something in production. But for the local development, it's pretty handy when you see all of the SQL queries and really can understand what is happening with your application in any given time. So the rest is pretty much the default values, which you can like keep from project to project without even any changes. And this is probably one type of configuration file that I'm keeping consistently for all of my projects, because it's just very useful to have this kind of flexibility, and also a lot of default values written directly in configuration file at the same time. So you can't get this kind of flexibility with your JSON configuration as a standard TypeORM suggests. After adding this configuration file, we have to connect to our database whenever there is a new request coming up, or reuse existing connection that we are using. So for that, there should be really a simple function that handles all of that without making us to write all of that logic, like reusing existing connection or connecting whenever there is a new request. We just have to make a new file inside our helpers. Remember, I'm doing helpers when I need a generic function that I can follow along all of the projects. And this kind of database connection is one of that parts that I'm probably going to use in multiple places when trying to connect or getting a database connection. And in this file, we actually defining one function called dbconnect, which actually tries to get an existing connection from TypeORM itself, which is a global variable inside that library. And if that connection doesn't exist, or we are not connected yet, I'm just trying to connect to database. And if there is an error, or like if even like the connection exception happened with the try catch, I'm throwing an error here, hey, there's a database connection error, and notifying an actual error and not allowing to moving because of this throw exception, which is going to be handled over the actual express, and an actual response going to be 500 error from express application. And all we have to do is just export this file as well from actual helpers, and then use this database connection as a middleware for our index application, which is going to be executed whenever there is a new connection and even before all our routing is happening. So this kind of helper function is actually keeping our database connection consistent and makes sure that all our requests have proper database connection. And because this function reuses an actual connection if it already exists, we are getting almost zero overhead for our database connection logic. So it's pretty useful, and at the same time it's very robust by just giving you alerts or 500 error when there is a database connection issues directly without making any other code parts to fail, which could be crucial for some applications. And I had this kind of experience when, let's say, application doesn't really checking an actual connection existence and accepted a request for writing something in database, and then write failed, but client already sent a request with the success status, and that data basically was lost. So that kind of issues are just prevented because this kind of checking doesn't allow an actual express to move to the next function when there is an error inside this connection function itself. So after having this database setup done with communication with Express, we basically have to make an actual entity itself as a model or as a database table expressed as a TypeORM itself. So for that, we just have to make another folder called entity here, and inside that we are going to make a user.ts. I'm using a base thing for defining an entity or database models with an uppercase, just indicating that there is a class and it's a pretty important part for the entire application. So inside this user.ts file, we basically defining all of the things that we want to have for our user database table, including all of the like index database PostgreSQL index things like email and like password column and first name, last name, photo if we have something for the user, phone, about, like created at and updated at, with created at is actually have a default value of now, and this type of definitions is actually by default for TypeORM. It actually translates everything back down to SQL query, which then gets populated to an actual SQL table for PostgreSQL side. So this class is an actual representation of user table, and this name indicates that table name inside an actual PostgreSQL is going to be a user with lowercase, and this model is actually going to be picked up by TypeORM using our ORM configuration file. As you can see here, we have an entities which are going to be like asterisk, which a gob file selector, everything, which means like everything inside an actual entity directory. And based on compilation parameters, if we have already compiled that project and we are running it in production, it is going to be use a GS extension. If it's in development mode, then it is going to be use a TS extension itself. So these kind of definitions are quite enough to have our database connection with a PostgreSQL. The rest is actually just an implementation side of having a user connection with the PostgreSQL and using an actual TypeORM functions, for example, to make a new user, or even just to delete or update one. So if we are going to use a few TypeORM functions, let's say we want to make a public static create user function which gets, let's say, email and password during registration, and it makes a new user based on this information. This is also going to be an async function, and for this we have to get a repository. The way that TypeORM operates is actually it uses a model called repository, then an actual table, and the repository keeps everything inside that state, which means that you can use a transaction based on that repository, or you can roll back everything if you define an actual repository for that specific model. So for that we are making user repo and making get repository, which is a standard function inside TypeORM, and getting an actual user class. And then we actually making user repo that save and making it await, and making user repo that create then assigning like email and password, or probably we have to hash this. I don't have any hashing library right now, so we can just use this, no, doesn't matter. So after this 2 lines, we will get a new user created, and this function can actually return that entity object, which is going to be an object of a user type. And we can do actually this in a different way by just making a user object from a user class itself, then adding these options here like email equal to email that we have, and user.password equal to password. Then we don't need this anymore, and we can just save this one and return an actual user itself that we used during declaration itself. So these simple steps is kind of like the power of TypeORM, or pretty much any kind of ORM itself. But the power of TypeORM that I really like is that it just giving a huge autocomplete functions that you can use like with your text editor, because the TypeScript, your editor is picking up all the type functions, and it's really helping to avoid any type errors. Let's say if you are assigning some kind of like integer to your email, or any kind of like wrong type assignment, like if you are assigning a string to your created a date, it forces you to format that with a proper date format to avoid some mistake on the database side. So these kind of tricks allows me to write a simple database connections and use these database tables and queries directly as a TypeScript classes and functions. Hope you enjoyed this, and hopefully you can try this out on your own using my repository that I have on public GitHub page, and you can find the link down below. So if you haven't yet subscribed, please subscribe to my channel. It helps me a lot to keep forward with this and make more TypeScript or Node.js based tutorials moving forward. So don't forget to like this video and comment if you have any questions or something unclear. Let me know, and stay tuned.